And now we revisit a story which dominated headlines constantly in 2014, and for good reason. It was the Ebola crisis in West Africa. Now there's another kind of crisis: corruption. Last November, we reported that the international aid charity, the Red Cross, told us it had been the victim of fraud totaling some $5 million. That was, of course, money badly and urgently needed to help combat the Ebola virus, which had overwhelmed several West African countries until 2016 and eventually killed more than 11,000 people. Now, 2 victims who survived Ebola are suing the government of Sierra Leone in this first international court case. They filed in the regional West African court in Nigeria, alleging that the absence of accountability, meant that the third of the money, some $15 million, was unaccounted for. Obi Cisse was a senior director of the National Ebola Response Centre in Sierra Leone, known as NERC. I asked him when he came into our NewsHour studio, was there a problem when he was there?
Yes, there was. Controls around financial disbursements, controls around contracting procedures were already weak. And so the advent of Ebola, the emergency, the fast inflow of funds, the sort of emergency nature of the demands meant that lapses were quite easy to happen.
And was this a question of 1 or 2 individuals, or did you get a sense, since you were at the heart of it, that there were actually quite a few people involved, even systemic?
Well, it was systemic. What we found when we came in at the National Ebola Response Centre was a whole bunch of contracts that had been issued either for feeding or for buying ambulances or for a whole lot of support services to deal with the Ebola response. In some cases had been improperly awarded. Some of the contracts were given to companies that did not even have a business registration document. There was no evidence that competitive bidding had been done for some of these contracts. Typically, healthcare workers were entitled to risk pay every week for their time on the front line to encourage them back to work, since they had all run away, fairly given the amount of risks they were facing. But there were instances where facility managers, matrons at hospitals, not all, but small number, at hospitals will replace the names of their staff on that list with names of their friends and family. And so at the end of the month, the staff go on strike saying we haven't received our pay, yet we at the NERC are saying, well, who did we pay? So there were huge lapses at every level, at the top level, but then all the way down the chain. But this is not atypical of the way the operating system is in Sierra Leone.
So at the time when you were in the centre, you raised concern about this?
Oh, yes, we did. In many cases, we and our fiduciary agents, which was an independent audit firm that did our accounting function, had to revisit some of these contracts and demand that people bring in documents and demand that some sort of regularization is made.
And did it work?
It worked in some cases. In other cases, it didn't work because of the leverage that some of these suppliers would have over you. If somebody is due to be feeding a unit that has Ebola patients and Ebola staff, and you start querying their feeding lists and you start querying their documentation, they simply just stop the feeding. And then there's a scandal on the news, and then you get calls from the president, then you get calls from everybody. The narrative becomes the National Ebola Response Centre is sitting on Ebola money whilst Ebola patients are starving. And so you end up having to make that payment. But that does not remove the truth that there was a lot of money that was stolen or misspent.
The BBC was told in November that people would be held to account. Are there certain individuals who will be seen as responsible for this?
We hope that there will. We pray that there will.
Just hope and pray? I mean, is there a political will to tackle this, or is Ebola over now?
I am yet to see the political will. We have a very strong Auditor General who does her job, holds institutions and agencies to account. But then after that, things seem to fizzle out. Parliament neither presses, nor do I see the Anti-Corruption Commission. So that's why we say we hope and pray, because we believe that people who were involved in misappropriation of Ebola funds should be brought to book. This is blood money. But if you want to look at how well Ebola funds were managed, you cannot restrict yourself to the government of Sierra Leone. Something like 62% of the total funds given by the World Bank to fight Ebola went to UN agencies. The government of Sierra Leone has never had the opportunity to audit the UN for its management of those funds. So if we are to do an honest assessment of how well Ebola funds were managed, the government of Sierra Leone is one for sure, but the United Nations should also answer.
And there you have it from Obi Cisse, who was with the National Ebola Response Centre in Sierra Leone.